Hello, hello. Hope everyone's doing really well. So today I wanted to talk about, one of those things that just comes around every so often to just illustrate a point. And, depending on what you want to talk about or what point you're trying to illustrate, what principle you want to talk about, there's always something going on, right? The government's always doing something to make a libertarian point if you know where to look. But some of these points are easier to understand or less counterintuitive than others. There's some things that people intuitively get. So the idea that, the government taxes people, people understand that. Maybe they think they're justified, maybe they, think that they're onerous, or maybe they could be lower or higher, but people understand that taxes are a thing. And you don't need a dramatic example to illustrate that. But every once in a while, there's certain things about government that one of the big insights of especially libertarians, although not exclusively, is to understand that the way people think that it works, the way people imagine that it works, is very different from how it actually works. And in some places, exactly the opposite. So every once in a while, you'll have something that will illustrate that. And so something like this would be the idea, for instance, that the FDA exists to protect people, right? It's there to protect people, and if we didn't have the FDA, we'd all be dying of bad drugs or whatever. And then you get an example of people who are dying because the FDA is not allowing them to take treatments, and especially cases where they're terminally ill, so there's no question that if there's no danger of them, taking a bad drug and then dying, because they're going to die anyway, so why not let them? And so you have something like the movie The Dallas Buyers Club that kind of isolates that. So we're getting part of that right now with this whole situation with GameStop, because most people think that government regulations are there to constrain business and to protect consumers. A lot of people think, when they're arguing, that we live in a free market, that we're in a deregulated free market laissez-faire system. And I suppose, depending on your definition of what you mean by that, that could be true. But this is illustrating that this is not the case, right? That we have a situation where regulations are there to protect business, to protect established people. And this is kind of got crystallized for me when I saw Elizabeth Warren saying that, Wall Street is a casino. No. In a casino, yes, you can bet and you can make money, but if you lose the bet, then you owe the money, right? You'll be in debt and you have to pay, and if you're, rich and powerful, maybe you'll get a polite letter and they'll go to court. If you're not, some people are going to take you out back and make you pay that way. But that's not Wall Street, because in Wall Street, as Kucinich pointed out years ago, what we really have is a system of private profits and socialized costs, right? Any system that's going to have bailouts or subsidies that favor winners and losers, which every regulation will do this, whether that's the intention or not, people can argue. I would say most of the time that's the actual intention, but who knows for sure. But you have a system where if you make money, let's say you short GameStop and GameStop goes down and you become very wealthy, you get to keep that. But then if your expectations go down, if GameStop's stock goes up, even for some silly reason like a Reddit mob, buying their stock, and you lose your money, but the government comes and says, no, you can't lose your money, we're not going to allow that to happen, then we don't have a free market. We have regulations that are there to benefit specifically the people benefiting from it, the hedge funds in this case, and certainly not laissez-faire. And if it's understood that that's likely to happen in the first place, and we have a long history of this now, going back at least to the 1970s, if not before, in fact, really to the 1940s, but at least since the 1970s. So if you expect to be bailed out, if you're politically well connected, then that creates moral hazard. You're going to act very differently from the first day. The first thing that you do, everything that you do is going to be different based on that. It's not a casino. It's not a casino when you know that you can't lose, right? It's not really gambling when you get to keep your winnings, but you can't lose anything because the laws will be changed, the regulations will be changed, or you'll be bailed out at the end of the day. And that's what we have, and that's what we have had in the United States for a long time. And it's very frustrating to see this. It's very interesting because when you have debates about people who defend the government, typically when you're talking about things like regulations in general, they'll say something along the lines of, we needed regulations, and the history of the United States is the history of a progressively beneficent federal government, especially, but also the state governments to a lesser extent, coming in and regulating to make things better, right? To make things safer for consumers, to make things safer for investors. They're making it so you can't lose your savings and all this other stuff. And there's all these laws that have been changed. There's all these regulations that have been enacted, and it's made our country better, and everything's better because of these regulations. And then some kind of crisis happens, and then it's because we have a free market and we're totally deregulated. And it's like, but wait, you just outlined that not only do we have regulations, but that's a good thing and we need them. And that's been, so as Scott Horton said once, they have this narrative of this progressive and interventionist mixed economy state that's regulating everything, and it really is regulating almost everything. People talk about deregulation. I don't know what exactly they mean by that. If one regulation changes, or even if one regulation was removed, if the Federal Register increases by 25,000 pages a year, you don't have deregulation, in any kind of net sense. But people will then just pretend like Ron Paul has been the president since 1900, and that we've lived in the era of what people would call the Gilded Age, or unbridled capitalism. Not quite true. Truer than it is now, but not quite true even then. And you could argue that I would argue actually quite explicitly that the cause of the problems that they did have in the 19th century were from the areas where they diverged from free market, right? When they had regulations in banks and railroads, the two places that had the most subsidy, the most intervention early on, those were the areas that caused the most problems for people, and created an entire social movement, the progressive movement, and later to basically, look, we have these industries, banks and railroads especially, that have all this power because the government gave them all this power. So what we should do is give the government more power to try and curb the power of the. This is like asking Sauron to curb the power of the Nazgul. Okay, like, man, Sauron, the Witch King, is really powerful. Maybe if we gave your ring back, you could keep him in line better. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It's actually probably a pretty accurate metaphor too, even though Tolkien would not say that he did metaphor. But be that as it may, so we have this pretending like there's no regulation, that everything is deregulated, like there's an absolute free market, and there's not. Now, it then becomes a more difficult question because we have certain free abilities. There is private property. We don't have communism, so that's great. We have a mixed economy, and then all of a sudden, we have to talk about the nuance of what the regulations, what effects they have, which ones are in play, which ones aren't. But there's just kind of this knee-jerk that if something bad happened, it's because the government doesn't have enough power. And it's almost non-falsifiable, too. They can always say, well, there wasn't any deregulation now or last year, but if I can find something even 10, 20 years ago, then we can point to that and say that's the cause. Even if the net number of regulations have gone up and up and up and up, we can say, well, this one time they didn't go up as fast, so that's the problem. And so that's why we get all this talk about Glass-Steagall, which I am repeatedly told Glass-Steagall happened under Bush. So it's nice to get a lecture about that from somebody who thinks it happened not under Clinton. But they're not casinos because you don't lose your money. And people talk about, well, isn't it great though, because you want your bank to be insured because you don't want to lose your savings. I'm like, I don't want to lose my savings, but let's say that I have a friend who, back a couple years ago, he called me on the phone and he was like, hey, this was during the big Bitcoin boom. He's like, I just bought $25,000 worth of Litecoin. what is Litecoin? And I said, well, that was a question you definitely should have asked yourself before you bought $25,000 of it. And I hope the best for him, and Litecoin hasn't, vanished or anything. But let's say that, Litecoin went to zero or went very, very low, and he lost, basically all that money. I don't know if that actually happened. I don't know what ended up happening to him. This was years ago, and I never talked to him again. But would that same person who says, well, I'm glad that we have an FDIC, and I'm glad that the banks are insured by the federal government, would you say, well, that person should be made whole too? Like, he should have all his Litecoin replaced? Or somebody who bought a lot of precious metals, should they have, if the price of gold or silver collapses, should those people be made whole? If you invested in a company and that company goes bankrupt, right? All these people buying stock in GameStop. The long-term prospects for GameStop are not very good. Not impossible, but they're not very good. And let's say they end up losing a lot of their money. What are you going to say that they should be made whole? Like, is the idea that we can just have the government eliminate all risk because but they don't. See, they only protect certain types. So that's a subsidy, right? Your savings will be protected in a bank, FDIC, but they won't be protected if it's in crypto or if it's in precious metals, or if you invest them in a company that's not politically connected enough to get a bailout, right? So it's very interesting to see this mentality of like calling for regulations, even though it's clearly to protect certain groups, established companies, established firms, well-connected, politically connected firms, and to guarantee their profits. I believe that people should own their profits, absolutely, but it's a profit and loss system. And if you don't allow for losses, if you don't allow for people to pay for their mistakes, then there's no real disincentive for making mistakes. So it creates moral hazard. And I just don't, I've never gotten a good answer on this when I bring it up. And I think part of it is people just don't know what it is. But like, if you go to a casino and you are told that if you gamble and you win, you get to keep the winnings, but if you gamble and you lose, you can't lose anything, or maybe you can lose, up to $100, but anything past that you can't lose. You're not going to gamble the same way as you would if you were liable for the losses, right? You just fundamentally will gamble differently. You will take more risks. Doesn't mean that you're a worse person or anything like that. Just it's incentivized. That makes more sense in that case. So that's the system that we have. We've had implicit and explicit bailouts now since the 70s. Have they bailed out every single company? No, but to think that that's not proof that they don't do it to some, or will do it for some, or under the right circumstances, that's wrong. They clearly will. They'll bail out banks. Your bank should not be this magical thing that never goes away, that can never go bankrupt. They need to be able to realize that bad loans can make them pay, that they can lose money and go out of business. So they will be more careful about who they loan money to, right? It doesn't make sense. Like, there's finite resources, and it doesn't make sense to give out loans to everybody. This is one of the problems, to use this. The Venus Project was a harebrained scheme in so many ways. But it really did illustrate a lot of these problems because, they would talk about, well, everyone gets whatever they want. And one of the things when I talked to Roxanne Meadows, who was Fresno's longtime partner, I guess, partner in communist crime, she said that, I said, well, how are you going to plan investments for, like, are you going to build a moon base, or base on Mars, or base on the bottom of the Earth, or at the bottom of the ocean? Like, how are you going to pick, right? There's only so many resources. So are you going to direct them? How are you going to decide which thing they should be invested towards? Because there's not an infinite number, right? You can't say, well, let's build the moon base and the Mars base and the undersea colony and the Greenland colony and the Antarctic colony. And like, there's enough resources to do some of them, or some bit, or maybe do all of them a little bit, but not very well. But there's not enough to just, the human imagination, the things that not only we could imagine, but they could be potentially useful for us, far outnumber the number of things that we can actually physically do at any moment, right? There's an actual limit to the things that we can actually do. And just saying that, well, banks should be able to loan out to anybody, and be bailed out if they go out. That's ignoring that and saying, no, not every project deserves a loan. Not every project deserves resources. Not every company that has an idea for an expansion or whatever is justified. And nobody knows apodictically for sure which ones are which, but there needs to be discretion there. It needs to be the risk that you can make a mistake. Otherwise, yeah, we're just going to waste a ton of resources doing stuff that doesn't matter. And that's what we've been doing now for, a century. And it's wasting a huge number of resources. And some of this, to help my hair is crazy, people. I haven't seen my barber in months. My barber's on my jiu-jitsu team, and I just haven't been able to meet him in a while. But so we have this massive amount of what I would call investments that wouldn't happen if it wasn't for the government subsidy, and it could be, in some places, this could be obvious, like they're getting a direct subsidy. The government's paying them a lot of money. You work for a company that's getting all these contracts from the government. It's very funny how this works. So I'm reading an excellent biography on Lyndon Johnson called The Years of Lyndon Johnson by Robert Caro. Superb 5-volume work. Oh, it's going to be 5. It's only 4 have been done, but it's superb 5-volume work. And Johnson had, for his entire career, he had many people who paid for political influence from him, right? He took a lot of money. He took a lot of bribes. He's corrupt as sin. But the one who was with him the longest and who gave him the most was a guy named Brown and Root, Edgar Brown. They ran a company in Texas, and they originally made almost all their money building roads for counties. They get a contract to build the roads in a county in Texas, which, by the way, so almost all their money was from governments. But Ed Brown had a desire to build big. He wanted to build big things. And so he wanted to build a big dam in this part of Texas, and he wanted the government to pay for it. And there were regulatory reasons why that couldn't happen. It was illegal. The federal government didn't own the land, and blah, blah, blah. There are all these reasons it couldn't be done. And so they needed a person in Congress who could make it legal. And Lyndon Johnson at the time was not in Congress. He was a secretary for a different congressperson, but he wanted to be in Congress. And Lyndon Johnson had the ambition to be president, and he saw, well, the first step is Congress, then Senate, then president, or VP, and then president, as it ended up happening. And Ed Brown, he basically said, okay, if I get elected to Congress, I will make this dam legal. And Ed Brown donated, they think, over $100,000 to his campaign, his first campaign for Congress, which was an absurd amount at the time. It still is. And he got elected. And Ed wrote him a letter saying, I am for you. We don't have to agree on anything, but I will give you as much money as you need to pass the laws that I want. And Ed Brown went on to become worth hundreds of millions of dollars, because during World War II, he got all these contracts to build Navy bases and these are things that his company had no experience doing. What's so funny, so Ed Brown, his entire career has been getting fucking money from the government. But then he was against welfare and was like, oh, they're just gimme, gimme, gimme. That's how he said it. Gimme, gimme, gimme. People just want fucking welfare. His whole company was suckered and created on the government tit. And he not only, and it wasn't just like the government tit was spraying and he caught it, he was going and doing the squeezing. And the person who did the squeezing for him was a guy named Lyndon Johnson, who became president, as most of you should know. So there's that kind of subsidy. Sorry to the tangent there, but it's on my mind. So there's that kind of subsidy. But then you have things that, like, they're not directly getting money, but because of the regulatory framework, because of of what's there, you get stuff flowing there. So, another thing, insurance companies, or medical insurance. Why did that happen? Whatever happened to, like, just paying a doctor, right? Everyone's seen old films or old TV shows that are set in the 19th century or early 20th century, and the doctor shows up at the house. And like, whatever happened? Why did that change? Well, they didn't pass a law saying that you can't do that or that, everyone has to use insurance. But they did do is say, well, in World War II, they set maximum wages, and they said, you can't, because they were inflating, and, half of the money for World War II, they did actually tax, but they also were spending more than they brought in. So there was a lot of inflation. So they did not want there to be a lot of inflation. So they were setting ceilings. They were price fixing everything. Right. And then they were also saying there are maximum wages. Right. People call, all these liberals who say, we love FDR, minimum wage. Fucking FDR set maximum wages during World War II. But companies still need to compete for labor. If they can't compete with a wage, they'll compete with other things. And so you could offer perks, you could offer whatever it was. The thing is, the way the tax structure is if you paid somebody a wage, that's taxed. If you pay them for medical care, that's not taxed. Well, that's subsidizing that. And so born was the medical insurance industry, right? This horrible industry that everyone blames on the free market and thinks this horrible thing that capitalism created, and goddamn, it's so horrible, and we need the government to protect us. The government created that beast, right? It was the government's idea. The government has suckered it ever since. That tax code has never changed. And there's a million other regulations that make medical even worse, but so these things wouldn't even exist, and now we're down the pipe, and now we're having this, there's too little regulations, government's too small. So, yeah. So, it would be nice if Wall Street was a casino, and it would be nice if you could actually lose your money. It would be nice if you had to think about where you put your money, right? It would be nice if you had to go, where am I going to put my savings, right? Because that bank is offering a really high interest rate. How is that possible? Maybe they're making risky loans. Well, maybe it's worth the risk, right? I don't begrudge somebody who makes a profit, but that means taking a risk. It has to. And if you think, well, I don't like risk, the idea of risk, that makes me upset. Well, you're still going to have this huge waste of resources. And if you're going to say everything is safe and nobody can, it's going back to the TVP again. If the Venus Project said, well, it would be elitist for us to decide which organizations, which investments get done or not. Who is Jacques Fresco to say whether we make a moon base or a Mars base, which of course he would say that he does know that, and we should ask him. But so we'll just fund everybody, right? Everybody gets everything for free. So that's the problem, right? And it's like this purgatory that we find it, because I know this is going to happen. And there's a nuance. Look, people could say, well, look, we need regulations, and yes, there's a cost, and yes, they have negative consequences, but on net they're good, and here's why, and something needed to be done. Okay, there's an argument to be had there, but most people don't even say that. They just come out saying there aren't any. Like we live in a free market capitalism that's completely laissez-faire. I'm like, if only that was true, but it hasn't been true. If it was ever true, it hasn't been true since the last 3 decades of the 19th century, if ever, and really even then. So I wish that it was more like a casino, right? And I wish that you could lose your money. And it's so funny to have the same people who are like, I hate big business, and I hate the fat cats, and I hate the capitalists. By the way, I want them to be bailed out, and I want them to never have to suffer any consequences whatsoever. And I want them, and what's the, well, they paid back the bailouts. What's the big deal? It's like, well, not everyone got a bailout. So the companies that did got bigger at the expense of the ones that didn't, right? So the big companies, the politically welcome companies, become more powerful and more wealthy. And then the consumers have fewer choices because they can't give it to everybody. And if they did, that would just be even more inflation and more waste. So they don't. So just my thought on that, guys. I'll get some of your questions. Buy silver. That's a good idea. The hardest thing about the Wall Street casino fiasco is that the very people that libertarians would defend day in and day out immediately went for government regulations. I don't know which people you mean. You'd have to specify. When the actual free market started doing its thing. I work for a bank that was bailed out in 2008, and they're still big on pushing mortgages on people that are broke. Yeah, of course they are, right? What's the problem? That like if they get anything, they'll get money off of the payments, and then if something really bad happens, they'll just get bailed out, right? The Fed, and they don't even through the Fed system, they can just do it that way. You don't even have to have a bailout done. So it's a completely rigged game. During the 2020 election, LP nominee Joe Jorgensen said that in an interview that Antifa is arguably more fascist than our own government. Do you agree with her statements? Why or why not? I think there's a lot of room for nuance there, because what you're talking about is an established system that has an infrastructure, that has a military, that has a history, right? So the U.S. government has been around a long time, done a lot of wars, done a lot of killing. They have a huge military. They have all these right? And so Antifa has never done anything even remotely like that or on that level. But you could also say that their political philosophy is one that, if they were to gain the reins of power, would be much worse. And I think that's totally fair. We could say the same thing. Let's go back to the Antifa of 1905 Russia. And you could say, look, these Bolsheviks and these Mensheviks, they're not so bad. What have they ever done? The Tsar has done all these horrible things. The Tsar has a secret police. The Tsar has done all these wars. The Tsar is really bad. And indeed, the Tsar was really bad. So does that mean the Bolsheviks were not fascist? And no, of course they were, but they weren't in power yet. So I think it's kind of similar to that. And there's a nuance to that answer, because they haven't done anything even remotely close to what the government's done, but they don't have the power to. What they talk about doing is clearly much worse, though, if they had power. So how would influence the government be prevented? How do we prevent corruption? I think that is impossible. Let's be honest. There's too much at stake, and there's too many ways to get around it. There are measures you can take that might mitigate certain types of corruption, but then the corruption will just move someplace else. So I think that the best way to do that is to lower the incentive, and to lower the incentive, you have to reduce the power of the state. A state that can regulate everything versus a state that can regulate only half of things is only going to be half as corrupt, right? There's half as much reason. So the smaller the state is, the less reach it has, the less ability it has, the less it's going to be corrupt. Now, the problem with minarchism, and here's my anarchism coming through, is there just doesn't seem to be any way to get a minarchist state that isn't incentivized to try and grow. Now, there can be circumstances around a minarchist state that make it very difficult to grow. Maybe there's financial problems or geographic reasons, or maybe there's cultural reasons that curb its expansion or whatever. But their incentive is always to grow, and so however small you get it, it's just like you're resetting it to grow again. But the smaller it is, the less corruption there's going to be, right? It's if you have a small town with a tiny budget and a little population, there's not going to be tons and tons of people trying to control what's going on. There won't be billions of dollars being invested into lobbying that state. But if you have something like the federal government that has such, I don't want to say unlimited, but vaguely unbounded powers and such a huge tax base, then there's just no way to get around that trough. It's just too big. And there's just too many ways to get around it, and there's too much incentive for it. It's too important. You can be the most libertarian capitalist in the world who hates the government and thinks that everything should be free and blah blah blah. But if you don't get in on the game, then you're going to get screwed by your opponents, right? You can go oh, I'm just going to be a successful capitalist, but your competitors are going to go and they're going to influence they're going to use the government to perform some major regulatory capture on you. And the firms that don't get with the program get destroyed, right? They get marginalized, or they get with the picture. And there are examples of companies that didn't lobby very heavily, weren't that involved, and then their competitors go and hit them with an antitrust law or something, and next thing you know, they've got their lobbyists, they're involved. And that's the thing that people need to understand. There's this myth, it's the Upton St. Clair myth. Right, Upton St. Clair wrote a fictional novel called The Jungle, which, people treat that like it's some kind of historical document. And that'd be that would be like treating Atlas Shrugged as a historical document. Whatever merits there are to the book, it's fiction. He made it up, and he was a propagandist on top of that. And he said he was. I'm not just putting words in his mouth, but there is this pernicious idea, this pervasive myth, that consumers who have been aggrieved by producers are the ones who pushed for regulations. That it was people who got bad meat from Armour who went to the government and said, please create an FDA because I got I got botulism because I ate a bad can of meat. No, the federal regulations were pushed by the big producers, right? The very first thing that they pushed for, this is, a quirk of history that not many people know, but like, was they wanted them to set up a regulatory agency so they could more easily export to Europe. So there are these growing European markets. There was a huge demand for American agricultural goods, grains and wheats and corn, but also for meats. And some of these European countries, especially like Germany, wanted to import the meat. They needed the calories, but they wanted there to be this certain level of like quality control. And the thing is, like, there was nothing about it that they couldn't have done themselves. Like, ARMR could have said, okay, this is the quality control that we need to export to Germany, so how are we going to pay to have that done? And they said, well, let's have the government pay for it, right? So why should we have to pay? We'll have the federal government set up a regulatory agency to export, and we'll talk to our congressmen, and there's ways to make this sound perfectly kosher. Like, oh, we're not doing it to save our money. We want to help export American goods. And that's how the FDA really got started. And then after that, they think, oh, wait, we can change the regulations in a way that will hurt our competition, right? And they can make it very hard for smaller producers, smaller town butchers to meet the regulatory requirements that they put in, and we can get rid of part of our domestic competition. So that's what really happened. It wasn't that people, and I'm not saying that the quality of beef in 1900 is what we all would be happy with right now. But that wasn't like, that's not what led to the regulations. That's not what ever leads to like the lobbying firms and the special interest groups that are pushing for regulations, whether it's on toys or pharmaceuticals or healthcare or cars or computers or cell phones or helicopters or whatever it is, it's going to be that industry. And the people who work in that regulatory agency are going to be staffed with people who can make a lot more money after the fact working in that industry as consultants, and so they will definitely go there, right? And they're like, those industries, the special interests, they'll put in the money, they'll put in the time, they have a much more focused condense. It's the whole point of a special interest, right? The sugar tariff, it really is important to a couple of sugar producers who make millions and millions. Everybody else pays more for sugar and has to have corn syrup instead of sugar, but at the end of the year, it's not that big of a deal for most people, so there's no organization there, and that's just always how it is. That's just always how it is. It's how it's incentivized to be, and it wouldn't be as bad if we acknowledged that and just allowed ourselves to realize that, but instead we have to pretend that there's this mythical thing where consumers are begging the state, and the state, in an attempt to protect consumers, is coming down in its righteous might to protect them with regulations that are beneficent and benevolent and also wise, none of which is ever true. So, yeah, good question. But yeah, the government needs to be smaller. That's the only way. And obviously, if it gets to the point where there's no government, then there's no obvious place to go for the corruption, right? If you don't have a monopoly, then where do you go, right? If we had an anarcho-capitalist system, let's say, who are you going to bribe? Right? There's not to say there can't be corruption at all, but there isn't a monopoly, so there's nothing that has anywhere near the veneer of legitimacy, authority, automatic, right? It's like the perfect in. You get in and like you're in. Say, I want you to tell me why the government hasn't completely infiltrated and squashed down Antifa. I don't know. They probably have no reason to. Why do they care? Like, Antifa is not a threat to the government. Sadly, Americans are brainwashed and divided. The U.S. is a sinking ship. Well, yes, brainwashed and divided, I agree. Sinking ship, it's not a ship. And I don't know where is better. Like, where is the country where people aren't brainwashed, right? Like, yeah. People are just very brainwashable. I now know very well. Gary Chartier also says that government corruption isn't a bug; it's a feature. Yeah, there's lots of people who say that. I've referenced this before when Sam Harris was interviewing Sanjay Mukherjee about COVID, and Mukherjee just almost went apoplectic, not emotionally, but in terms of what he was saying. He was like, the fact that the FDA delayed testing for 6 weeks after they had tests that worked, he said, I cannot underestimate how harmful that was. Like, harmful in the terms of like thousands of people dying. And Harris's reaction to that wasn't to be aghast, it wasn't to be horrified, right? If we said, Sam Harris, Muslim extremists have killed 200,000 Americans, would he just like, yeah, that's a feature, not a bug? But that's exactly what he said regarding the FDA restriction. Like a regulation that in that instance, that single instance, could have killed hundreds of thousands of people and may have. He was like, oh, that's just a function. That's just a feature. That's not a bug. That's what we want. We want an FDA, and I just don't understand if these people understand opportunity cost. But like, when you have a regulation that prevents a drug to be on the market for years, it's not like that only has given you protection. Yes, it has given you some protection, but it's come at the cost of denying treatments to people who could use them. And it's not obvious that the number of people who die from the lack of treatment is going to be less than the number of people who would have died if you had legalized the drug earlier, and also made the drug more expensive and harder to get because of the cost of meeting the regulations. Right? There are single drugs. I looked it up. I'd have to look it up again. Let me look. Let me get it up. I don't want to say it and then have people be like, you just said it and you didn't quote it. So let me see. Single. It was like a prostate cancer drug. Let me look this up. Yeah, I'm not gonna look it up. But yeah, like the people that die because the drug isn't legalized, they just don't. There's a narrative. There's a narrative that people have, and those people don't have a narrative, right? That those deaths don't exist in Sam Harris's mind. He just doesn't. That they don't fit into his zeitgeist, and I'm picking him out, but like, and I respect him a lot more than most other people, but like these people who are, I mean, you could think about it like this. Right now, a lot of people die because of medical malpractice, because doctors make mistakes, not because they're evil or malicious, just because they make mistakes and they're humans. But well, okay, maybe we need better doctors. Wouldn't it be great if we had better doctors? And of course, if we could just like press a button and every doctor that we had just became a better doctor, that would be awesome. But we can't do that. So what would we have to do? We would have to raise the standards. We'd have to raise the standards on being a doctor. So there's lots of things we could do. We could say, well, make medical school twice as long and only graduate half as many doctors. Take do everything that we're doing right now, and then the bottom 50% of every class just be like, you know what? You're in the bottom 50%. You don't get a medical license. You're not a doctor. Bye. Right, and never mind all the those people then just wasted whatever $250,000 of and half their life. But so the only doctors that you have left are this top half, and that's definitely going to be on average better doctors, right? And it took twice as long, and blah blah blah. Okay, so we'll have better doctors then. We'll have half as many, but they'll be better. And do you think that just is a better situation, that everything is just better now? We'll just be safer? No. More people are going to die because there's way less medical care. Right? It's going to be astronomically more expensive. And actually, if such a thing was to ever to be actually proposed, it wouldn't be by me and it wouldn't be by AOC, it would be by the AMA. It would be the doctors who would advocate such a thing, because the existing doctors they would be grandfathered in, and then they'd have fewer new doctors to compete with them, and then they could charge higher, right? They would make more money because of that. But they can't say that's the reason they're doing it, so the kosher answer is to say, well, we're doing this to protect people, right? We're raising the requirements so the doctors will be better and will protect patients from having affordable health care in this case. So that's true with doctors. It's true with the bailouts. It's true with FDIC. It's true with medical insurance. It's true with everything. Sugar, computers, everything. Like I'm very primordial. I'm a very primordial guy, I guess. Did not know that about the history of the idea. Yeah, yeah. There's this complete mythology. You know, it's the same thing with railroads. It's the same thing with banks. It's always banks pushing for regulations. It's always now you can always find examples of a regulation that some people in the industry don't like, and then you can say, well, look, here's so and so, and they don't like this regulation. Okay, fine. Because uh, somebody in an industry doesn't like every single regulation doesn't mean that they're against regulations in general, or it certainly doesn't mean that they're for free market capitalism where there's completely laissez-faire. They might be for that if that was offered to them, but that's not offered to them. They have a system where there's a state, so they need to be involved in the state, and they can use the state, and they can do things with the state that they can't do on their own. Right? You can't get rid of all your competition on your own. It's impossible. But the government can do that. Right? You can't force people to be your customers, but the government can do that. Right? It's also ironic. I remember Diane Sawyer. Diane Sawyer was interviewing Nancy Pelosi after Obamacare passed, and Sawyer said, "You know, there seems to be a lot of vitriol against this bill. Can you explain that?" And Diane Sawyer or Nancy Pelosi said, "Some people will just do anything for the insurance companies. Obamacare requires everybody, on penalty of a fine and jail time if they don't pay that fine until recently, to be a patron of the insurance companies. Obamacare forces people to be customers of the insurance company, and you're telling us some people will do anything for the insurance companies. Yes, you, Nancy Pelosi, you made everybody become their customers. Nobody has the option legally to not become their customers now." And I don't know, I mean, I don't want to think she's stupid. She's probably not, but I'm like, how many people even understood that irony? I don't know. Glad you're back. Love the streams. Thanks, E. Why do you feel perfectly confident that you can go to PorcFest and face zero federal agent infiltration? Why is that? I never said that there's zero. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think it's that big of a threat. What are they going to infiltrate? It's not a central organization. Why are you not paranoid that I mean, because everyone's armed. Everyone's got a camera. So I'm sure there might be some, but I don't know what they'd be looking for. Are you really that harmless? I don't know. Maybe I am. Your audio is fine. The audio should be nice. I'm using a new mic, so everyone comment on the audio. I want the audio to be good, so. Man, big dumb fat cat, you just are such a negative person. Do the federal agents go and like study you too? Probably not. You must be completely worthless then. The Free State's measure of worth is how much infiltration they have. What do you think of Biden's presidency so far? Well, it's pretty new, Cinefan, and I haven't been paying too close attention. But obviously he's awful in every way. Let me see. Maybe I'll. How about that? Maybe my audio is better now. Maybe I can set it here. No, that's as high as it will go. My hair looks boss, thanks. It needs to be cut. I don't particularly like it like this. I just haven't had a chance to get it cut. Sound quality is good, just very quiet. Okay, I turned it all the way up. What's your opinion on the whole Keystone Pipeline ordeal? I think that it's very emotional, right? Because people act like it's a question of people project a lot. I mean, so I don't want to. the oil is going to be produced and the oil is going to come to the United States. If it doesn't come in the pipeline, it's going to come on a train. So to the people who are thinking that it's they're somehow putting it to the oil industry, or they're helping out Captain Planet, they're delusional in that case. Now, if you want to talk about sovereignty and eminent domain and all that, well, that's a different thing, and I agree with that. And there's this whole what lands belong to Native Americans and what can they do, and there's a lot of corruption there that's bad. So that I understand, and I don't believe in eminent domain. I don't believe in companies getting eminent domain or anything like that. So yeah, it's complicated. Tell your audience to smash the like button. Smash the like button there. Thank you, Herb. Good advice. Do you think the hedge funds shorting GameStop will ultimately get decimated soon? No, I think that they'll get bailed out. The rules will be changed for them not to hurt. I think that's the whole point. Yeah, the same people who worship democracy have no issue with Biden's government. Yeah, the same people who are like, Trump is ruining our whole system. Let's abolish the Electoral College. Yeah. Your hair does look really good. Can you explain that to me? Well, maybe they do infiltrate it, big dumb fat cat, and we just don't know about it. I mean, would you expect everyone to hear about that? Why do you just shrug your shoulders and dismiss this type of criticism? Because it's not that good criticism. I don't know. Like, your barometer is like how involved the federal government is, and by the way, you have no idea how involved it is or isn't. Like, because I'm not worried about it doesn't mean that it's not happening. I mean, I don't what's your barometer here? Are you getting investigated by the federal government? And if not, does that mean that you're just worthless? I don't think so. Is Grindr worth using for straight people? Got banned from Tinder for transphobia. No, I'm not a transphobe. Well, yeah, if you want to have sex with guys, Grindr's great. But if you're trying to have sex with girls, there's no girls on there, so, or no girls that you'd want to meet. So, no. People are memeing that Gates and Buffett are getting profit from the oil being transported by train. Yeah, it's not a question of the oil being produced. Like, people are projecting all this, and I don't say all of them. Like, some of the people on the ground maybe are talking about like tribal sovereignty and stuff like that, but most people are. Guys, I don't know what to tell you. Big dumb fat cat. We don't know that the state's not reacting to us. Oh, so as long as I have a YouTube channel, then it must not be. You got me there. Maybe I'm an agent. Maybe that's why they didn't take me down. Maybe I'm not censored because I'm part of the. Yeah. You can hear me fine. Thank you, Drew. I have a new mic, people. It's a nice mic. So you guys just have a problem. The day after Biden's election, feminist writer Naomi Wolf expressed regret about voting for Biden after finding out that he supported lockdowns. What do you make of that? I think that would make her really stupid for having voted for him. Like, I don't understand. Like, how could you have buyer's remorse? You had to have known. Sorry. Like, how could you have buyer's remorse for Biden? You had to have known what he was like. Yeah, the audio's fine, people. Turn up your volumes. So I mean, everyone hated Trump, and so they did, just went and voted for Biden, even though he's like the very worst of the Democrats in so many ways. So, yeah. The first bill in Congress introduced was to change voting rules to make mail in voting nationally implemented. Yeah, that's clearly, I mean, it's interesting this insistence on that. That couldn't be abused. Yeah. Uh, the audio is fine. How long have you been on? I've been on for 50 minutes. Oh, well, big dumb fat cat, I only condescend to people I don't respect. So I don't do that to everybody, but I'm doing it to you now. So sorry. Um, yeah. If the state's reacting to you, it's in the form of trolls and subversive tactics in the chat room. There we go. Problem solved. How can anarchy be feasible when government formation is likely to happen organically if a large group gets enough power and they become the ruler? See, this is actually a really good question. So, I think that there's a lot of telescoping that's happening here because it actually historically it took a very long time for states to start. They didn't start everywhere. It was a very halting process. A really good book on this, by the way, is Against the Grain. I think his name is Walter Scott or John Scott. So, agricultural societies go back 10 to 12,000 years. We don't get the first states really until, maybe 3,000 or 3,500 BC, so maybe 5,500 years ago, as far as we can tell. So you had settlements, agriculture, towns, cities, depending on what you want to call a city, but thousands of people living together and no state. And when they started, they really only started in a very few select places that had certain types of agriculture. They had to be basically irrigation agriculture. They didn't happen where there were hunter gatherers. They didn't happen where there were pastoralists. They didn't happen where there was so-called dry agriculture areas, where large agricultural areas that were not constrained. They had to be certain types of crops because there are certain types of crops that are not great for taxation. So like root vegetables, like potatoes, are very hard to assess for taxes, and so they actually don't make good basis for a tax base. So you say, well, we don't, that's not the case now. Yes, because there's I think the way to think about states is that they're a type of coercion, they're a type of expropriation that is incentivized to happen under the right technological conditions, right? If there's the right amount of technological interplay, you can have a system where it's easier for people to pay the tax than it is for them to fight off the state. Now it's funny though, but it's easy. It's much easier for a state to maintain itself once it exists than it is to form through genesis, right? An initial state offering is harder than a state that's already existing. So I think that it's wrong to think that they automatically happen because they don't. Many of them failed, and they didn't take root everywhere, and there's many thousands of years. I mean, people ask like when was the first time in human history that the majority of humans on the planet lived under a state, and it wasn't 3000 BC. It probably wasn't even the year 1000. So it's a good question, but the idea that it's automatically going to happen, most of human society, most of human history, right? As long as there's been a species, so 250,000 years, 350,000 years, most of the time that they've been modern humans, right? Genetically modern humans. So now you're talking about 70,000 years at least. There wasn't a state. Most of the time that there's been agriculture, there wasn't a state. Most of the time that there's been sedentism, there wasn't a state. And even when they started to arise, they didn't arise everywhere at once. So it's a misperception of history. It's a trick of cartography in a lot of ways. You look at a map and you see the lines, and you're like, oh, the whole world is covered in states. Well, they don't really govern all that much in much of that space, even though there are people there. So it is a question of technology and also of ideology. If people have ideologies that are very receptive to states, they're easier to exist. If people have ideologies that are very anti-state, doesn't mean that it's impossible, right? Coercion is always a possibility regardless of your ideology, but it makes it harder. And technology can also make it harder. This is kind of one of the hopes of crypto, right? Because you can make crypto could be the equivalent of having potatoes back in, the second millennium, right? They're hard to tax, right? If you can transfer funds and hide funds and encrypt funds in a way, if you can encrypt funds in a way that if they can't get your password, they can't get your money, then that is prohibitively very difficult for them, right? Or if you can just transfer it away or whatever, hide it so they don't know. And we're getting to the point where that seems like that could happen. There's also other things, like if you could, let's say there was force field technology and you could turn on a force field that would make you, invulnerable. That'd be very bad for states, right? If you could just be like, come and take them, and they couldn't get through your force field. I'm not saying that's about to happen. I don't think that we're about to get force field technology. I use it as a metaphor to demonstrate a point here. And the other thing would be ideology. If people have an ideology where they love states and they think they need states, states are easier than if they have an ideology that says, well, states are bad, we don't want states. Again, not to say it's impossible, not to say it could never happen. I'm not saying that. Obviously, historically, they can come about. But the idea that it's deterministic and that they have to, I think, is wrong. Okay, well, I'm way behind now. That's a good question, though, Hackham. Thank you. Uh, so trolls are fighting. Blah blah blah. Do you still believe Trump derangement syndrome is a thing after the so-called coup? I think that calling that a coup is stupid. He was the head of the military. If he was going to do a coup, he would use the army and the air force. Like, he wouldn't use a mob that was unarmed. And yes, I do think it's derangement syndrome. I heard again Sam Harris, who's definitely is one of the like prime examples of a Trump derangement syndrome person. He said, "Look, this was a violent mob." He goes, "This was a violent mob. One of them was caught with plastic handcuffs. If how many people stormed the Capitol? 5,000, 10,000. Just the average 5,000, 10,000 people in the United States. Like 5% of them or something will be concealed carry permit holders or something like that. There should have been hundreds of people with handguns, and the best you can do is, oh, we found some plastic handcuffs. Trump, if it was a coup, he didn't say anything like it's all gaslighting and dog whistles there, right? You'd have to say all of it was code. He never told them to storm the place. He told them to have a rally or whatever. And if he was going to do a real coup, he would have had the military do it. He's going to have middle-aged people just storm. Yeah. So I think it's a, and the double standard on how these people feel about riots and property damage is pretty hilarious. The TDS. What is the TDS? Oh, Trump derangement. Sorry. Do you think that the right lionized Trump just like the left lionized Obama? Well, so he definitely did get lionized by some people. Whoever is the president, somebody lionizes him. And you had, for instance, there are some people like in the religious right who were really projecting a lot of like messianic stuff onto Trump. There was a whole movie called The Trump Prophecy about some woman who had a prophetic vision from God that Jesus that Trump was going to get elected or whatever. So there was some of that, but I think that it was quite different because a lot of people view Trump as just like a hellraiser, and he's like this chaotic thing that's gonna take. But they didn't really think of him as a messiah. Whereas I think a lot of people did think of Obama, like Obama was a savior. Obama was going to make everything better. So yes, he was lionized by some, but I think that it was kind of different in how they were lionizing him. So agricultural societies existed before the state. Interesting. Absolutely, they did. There's no question about that. Agriculture goes back to the first agriculture that we can find, probably 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago. And here's another thing that people don't tend to understand is that it wasn't agriculture then sedentism. Sedentism predates agriculture. You started to have hunter-gatherer societies that in certain areas that were particularly productive if they had a lot of fish resources, if they had year-round availability of goods. Like, say, in the spring you'd have a migration, and in the summer you'd have crops, and in the fall, in the winter you'd have fish. Like, you would live there year-round, and you kind of developed a society based on the seasonal food supply. And so you started getting like these towns, these permanent settlements in like southern Mesopotamia, in the area now in Basra, and a lot of this area now is has been covered up in sediments, but or also in the northern part of Anatolia and Cappadocia. Also happened in places like in North America a few thousand years later. And so you had towns. I mean, a famous site is called Çatalhöyük, which is in Turkey. I'm not going to spell it because it's spelled with Turkish, but it's called Çatalhöyük. And it's like 4,000 or 5,000 people. There are a whole bunch called the Tripolian cultures in Ukraine. 4,000 or 5,000 people in a town. And these were pre-state, but they were sedentary and they were agricultural. And then they shifted to agriculture. And then they shifted to, not they, but like some of them started going into these more fertile areas of the river deltas in the Nile and the Euphrates and the Tigris, and switching to irrigation. And even then, it took, I think, something like 3,000 or 4,000 years of settled irrigation societies before the first states really took hold. And there probably were lots of attempts. You probably would have a situation where you have a local strongman who becomes very state-like, and maybe his son is, but then he dies, or people get pissed at him and he dies, and you kind of go back. So it's not like one guy appears and now you have a pharaoh and a king and you have a dynasty that then rules that area as the state until the modern day. You had lots of little flare-ups, thousands of these little Shaka Zulu type characters who become strongman in their lifetime or for a lifetime or two and then die, or attain more influence and power. And then you get into a semantic debate about when is it a state and when is it not a state. And there's this, I mean, people have hierarchies that they talk about, and they're based on anthropological evidence in history, but it's also not necessarily something that you can say is like is a law or a methodology where you go like an elder, right? Somebody who definitely is not a state, like somebody who doesn't have any executive power or legislative power, but just has a lot of authority. It might be a geriatric person who just everyone respects, and then eventually that can become maybe hereditary, or you get a situation where you have a clan leader, or then a big man, and then maybe later a chieftain, and then you can have like a quasi-state. And it seems that, but it's a gradual process, and it's also a halting one. There's one that goes back and forth, and states collapse repeatedly, and we have dark ages for that. So, yeah. My mom thinks that anyone who voted for Biden has no right to complain. Do you agree with the statement? No, I think people can complain, but they should just realize that they were being a little bit hypocritical. Um, every time I watch one of your videos, I end up adding a new book to my wish list. That's great. Which one did you add this time? I was always taught that the first state came about 10,000 years ago. That's completely false. There's no evidence of that. And I've never even heard that claim, to be honest. The first states are usually dated to the Uruk period, or maybe the Ubaid period in Mesopotamia, and then very soon after in Egypt, maybe 200, 300 years later in Egypt. The interaction between the Euphrates Valley and the Nile Valley is interesting and hotly debated. But yeah, we've got. I mean, people say Sumer history begins in the Sumer. Sumer is this region, and now like southern Iraq, Kuwait. The geography there has changed a lot because the Persian Gulf used to extend deeper inland and it's silted up. So a lot of the original sites now, they would have been originally closer to the coast, and now they're pretty far inland. You have Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Nippur, all these cities, and there's many of them. And those are kind of the first city-states, the first states that we know about that we can definitely show. Places like Çatalhöyük, like those are famous sites, they're towns, but they cannot find anything there to suggest that there's any hierarchy. They can't find anything to suggest that there's central planning. They can't find anything to suggest that there's an elite or a caste or anything like that. And so there isn't any evidence that they had anything that we would recognize as a state. And these are agricultural societies. There's thousands of people living there. So, I guess you could say, because you could argue maybe there's a state that leaves no archaeological evidence, and that's possible. One thing that I've heard pointed out is we look about a state that we definitely know did exist would be like Shaka's Zulu state, right? The Zulu state is a historical state, existed in historical times. And like we know, Shaka was a real person. But there's actually very little archaeological evidence. Like it exists in history, it was written about at the time. There are contemporary reports, there are people who interviewed and whatever. So there's no question that it was real, but like the societies that they had just didn't leave a big footprint. So you could say that it's possible that there were, but we just don't have any evidence. But then what are we speculating then? We're just completely saying, well, we don't have any evidence, so let's just assume. Oh, I'm controlled opposition. There we go, guys. Janissary, good reference. I made a quick $2,000 off of this. Good for you. Do you see corporations and government sharing data as very problematic? I do. Thank you for answering. Thank you for asking a good question, Hackham. Imagine the Branch Davidians were the force field. Yeah, different story. Imagine if the Branch Davidians had actually fought back. Like, seriously. Imagine if half the stuff the government said about the Branch Davidians were true, it wouldn't have been 4 dead ATF agents, probably all of whom got shot by other ATF agents by accident. Uh, oh shit. I think the complete divorce from reality from stock fundamentals and price and liquidation problems brokers are having due to over leverage are signaling a market crash. Look, we have a boom and bust cycle. I mean, I don't know. I've now lived through these, and I've read my Mises, so like it's gonna happen again. I just don't see how. I'm not one to predict when or exactly how or where the bubble's gonna pop, but it's gonna pop. And if you haven't been planning for that financially or in terms of survivalism, like I don't know, I get it if you don't have the money or you can't because you're a student or whatever, but like there's absolutely nothing to be gained from not being prepared for something. It's the Boy Scout motto: be prepared. Do you think Bush derangement syndrome and Obama derangement system existed too? Sure. I mean, look, Cinefan, I think that you could always say that with partisan politics, you just have people who automatically hate the other guy irrationally. The problem there is that both of those people, and Bush more, but both of those people really did deserve a lot, and they had a lot of fair credit. People hated Bush very often for the right reasons, right? For the Iraq War, he was despised for that, and rightfully so. Obama was not nearly as hated, even though he basically did the same kind of stuff. But there were people who just hated Obama because they hated Obama. They just, like the people who would criticize Obama for doing something that Bush had done and they had not cared about. I think TDS is a thing. It definitely is a thing. Do you think Biden will be more authoritarian than Trump with the passage of domestic terrorism bill? Biden is not going to have the resistance. I mean, the media was in the tank for him so bad. What are they going to do? Like come out against him? They're all culpable now. Like they're so tied in with it that they're not going to give him anything, and they're going to, you know, slander anyone who says anything against him as a terrorist. Did you already give your views of GameStop? I did. You came in too late. You'll have to watch the beginning. Um, the Scott book about the state, yeah, Against the Grain, excellent book, and it's a short book, so it's one you can read in like a single sitting. Against the Grain is a great book. Did you watch Wake on Netflix? I did, and it was very good actually. I think I did a review on it. I was surprised how much fidelity it had to the, as far as I know, the real thing. A really good book on that, by the way, is The Davidian Massacre. If you want to read basically the quintessential frame by frame everything that happened. There's a couple other ones. Wako, The Rules of Engagement is an excellent documentary also that covers that. And I recommend anyone who's interested in Waco, and I think that people should be interested in Waco. It's the government killing 76 people on national television and just walking away completely free. But Waco on, so originally wasn't on Netflix. It was on Paramount TV, and then Netflix picked it up like 2 years later. It's excellent. It's extremely accurate. They have a lot of little details in there. The only thing, and I was amazed how it gave the Davidians not only a fair deal, in one or two instances, I actually think it went a little too far for the Davidians. They make it explicit, and I don't know if this could really be known. They make it explicit that David Koresh really honestly believed everything, which that's probably fair. I mean, the guy memorized the Bible. He did seem to walk the walk. Because the allegation is that he was, just using this as a way to get sex, which I can totally understand that, and I think, who knows, that could be part of it. In the show, they make it very explicit that he doesn't like doing, like, he's like, I don't want to take pleasure in this. I feel like I have to do this. I feel like my children will bring it. He wasn't the Messiah, and I don't think he even thought his children would be the Messiah, but it's something about his children would be the ones who would bring society out of the apocalypse or whatever, in some sense. But it was like, it was presented as a duty. Now, theologically, I believe that is accurate. I have no idea if that's what David Koresh actually thought, or if he was like, hey, I can just have all these wives. Like, I thought that they were giving him a little bit too much credit. But other than that, it was perfect. The FBI informant that was there, Gary, what's his name? Gary Nestler, the FBI informant, the FBI negotiator, that's all there. That was all true. Ruby Ridge, having Ruby Ridge, I was amazed they put Ruby Ridge in there, where they killed Roger Weaver's wife, like, and his son, like Randy Weaver, sorry, Randy Weaver's wife and son. He was charged with murder and actually acquitted. It was great. I mean, I was absolutely shocked because the ABC did a docudrama on it like right after that was horrible. So yeah, I thought it was great. But if you're interested in Waco, you should definitely read The Davidian Massacre by, I want to say Carol Moore. Carol Moore or Carol Howe. I don't remember. Carol something. But Davidian Massacre. And Waco, The Rules of Engagement. It used to be on YouTube. You took it down, but I found you can find it on Vimeo, I think. And also the FLIR Project. FLIER, the FLIR Project. Though Obama is a Muslim communist, Glenn Beck stuff was always pretty funny to me. Yeah. I remember once Hannity criticized Obama for eating a cheeseburger in a manner he didn't like. Yeah, Hannity is the worst. Like, Hannity is, whoever he's for whoever the Republicans are for. He's not like somebody like Tucker Carlson. You can tell that there's something there. He actually has opinions, agree or disagree. Hannity, no. Waco was great. Yeah, it was great. It was a great documentary, great docudrama. The other thing I'm persuaded, that the ATF, um, through their, well, Delta Force, because Delta Force was there. There's no question that Delta Force was there. They were definitely there. That um, that many, look, that fire was bad. The ATF caused that fire with their fucking Bradley fight, with their tank that they drove in there and pumped like banned CS gas or whatever. But it looks like the Davidians, most of them, not David Koresh. David Koresh was killed by that. That was very accurate. And the thing, he gets shot by Steve Schneider, and then Schneider shoots himself. That exactly happened. But most of the Davidians fled out the back and were gunned down. And there's actually video of that from the FLIR, from the FBI had a drone circling the compound, and there's video of it. And I think the Davidians fled out the back, most of them, and were all shot. And the only ones who survived were ones who came out the front. For people like, I forget his name. He's the one. He's the Macaulay Culkin's character, Thibodeau, David Thibodeau. The ones who came out the front, where the media was on one side, they were far away. The FBI said, "Oh, Davidians have 50 caliber rifles, so nobody can be within 3 miles for your own safety because they'll kill you, obviously, even though there's no evidence of that." And they never found any 50 cals. And so there are these high-powered telephoto like video cameras showing the Davidians. The Davidians who came out the front, where there was cameras, they survived. That's like David Thibodeau. The ones who came out the back were all gunned down. The Davidian Massacre is great. The author's a great journalist. Yes, and also, the author of that, she's not a right-wing person. She's not sympathetic to the Davidians at all. At all. And she points that out. She's very left-wing as far as I can understand. It's just it's a very good book. And quite compelling read, too. The stock market crap is being used as, yet another excuse to transform the economy. Well, we have a lot of people who are transformers. She's a libertarian. Well, maybe she was after she wrote the book. Yeah, the thing about the Transformers is it doesn't matter what happens, the solution's always the same, right? It does not matter what happens. The solution is the government needs more power, right? And also, so the narrative is that the problem was there wasn't enough government. It doesn't matter how much government already exists. It doesn't matter how in a debate, they would always say, well, government solved all of our problems. It was government regulations that made our society grow. We went to the moon. There was this crazy line in what was it? The Network. Remember The Network with Jeff Daniels, great actor who I'm a big fan of, and Aaron Sorkin, who's a big liberal lefty who likes to think he's really sophisticated because he's super mainstream. The guy who made the West Wing, and A Few Good Men. So yeah, he's a good writer, good screenplays and stuff, and good dialogue. But like, there's a scene where like one of the reporters gives a speech about Glass-Steagall and how we went to the moon and won World War II and the highest standard of living. It's all because of this. And then, Clinton banned it, and that's all the problems of the 2008 collapse is because Glass-Steagall was taken down. And they believe that. They're like, wait. We don't have deregulation. The Federal Register is growing by tens of thousands of pages per year. Yeah, I'm really irritated with the GameStop crap. End goal is clearly to cut off average person's stock access. Yeah, you plebs should not have any say. You shouldn't have control. You shouldn't have any property. Private property is bad. You can just work on your like, it really is as he was using it as a metaphor, but like when why am I not remembering his name? Hayek's Road to Serfdom. Like, we're going to be serfs. We're like, we labor, and then, we might have a choice of how much of what we want to drink and how much of what we want to quote unquote save, but we won't get a say in what we save it and how it gets saved, how it gets spent, because the regulations will prevent that, right? The regulations will say, you're too dumb, you need to be protected, the market needs to be stabilized, and so we're going to tell you where, when, why, and how much, when. Yep. Would you agree with that? I I don't know. The thing, Xeris, it's a good question. I think the problem with that logic there is the idea that I don't think that they set it up. I think that they have an incentive to just call for regulations. You know, they clutch their pearls whenever they lose money, and they go to the government to come and fucking save it. Right? Whenever they lose big, it's so easy just going like, oh, this is a public public goods problem. They would, you know, it's for the public good. We need this to protect people. It's to protect consumers. So whenever they're going to lose money, they'll go to the government, and they can't say, well, it's to protect our profits or to make us richer, or we don't want to suffer the consequences of our bad decisions. So they won't say that, but they'll couch it in terms of consumer protect. We have a narrative here that goes back to Upton St. Clair, if not before. This is how you do right. You can do all the regulatory capture you want. You can do all the rent seeking that you want. All that's fine. You just have to couch it in terms of consumer protection, and then you can do anything. And people are there's a complete blind spot to this. Even very smart people just don't see this. There are some people on the left who do. Some of the best books on this are by Gabriel Kolko, and Howard's, and some of these people do get it. Triumph of Conservatism is a great book on this. And if you want a libertarian perspective, in Restraint of Trade basically comes to the same conclusion, but from totally opposite political point of view. So I don't think that they purposely created a crisis, and then, it's not like a 9/11 truth type scenario. It's more like that's just what they're incentivized to do. That's what they're going to do. That's what sells. That's how they do what they want. The moon landing was faked, but Stanley Kubrick insisted on filming on location. Maybe, I don't know. I don't think it's any more organic movement. The amount of money being slushed around is more. Yeah, that was my question. How many of these people on Reddit have enough money to go start buying lots of stock? But I don't know the numbers of how much. GameStop apparently wasn't very expensive at the time. It didn't have that many shares, so I'm not sure the logistics of how feasible that is or isn't. I'll have to admit. I like your hair. I'm gonna get a cut, Mark. So drink it in. Mm, Triumph of Conservatism is great. I'll credit Tom Woods for alerting me to that book. I think I read it probably at this point 9 or 10 years ago. Have you read Soul's Vision of the Anointed? I think I listened to it on audiobook at one point. Were you ever into JFK conspiracy theories? Oh, definitely. Those are some of the juiciest, best ones. Like, I'm I'm convinced there was multiple shooters. Um, so I think Oswald was involved, but I think other people were involved too, and I think that's pretty much non-controversial. It's interesting to see the pains that people will go to say that's not. It's like when people say Epstein, wasn't murdered, right? Like there's people who have in their zeitgeist the idea that that sort of thing cannot happen. Like the skeptic, the Michael Shermers, the Sam Harrises of the world, who are just like, that can't happen. Like I have a worldview where the legitimacy of the state cannot be questioned in that way, even though that's not even really directly questioning the legitimacy. That's like one official gets murdered. What does that even have to do with the legitimacy of the state necessarily, right? But they just cannot bring themselves to believe it. And they also have, and this was important. Like the CIA, invented that term conspiracy theory to say, look, this is discredited and kooky. And granted, many things that are conspiracy theories are kooky and discredited. And then they lump that in with stuff that's not. Like JFK getting assassinated is not kooky. Okay, LBJ winning his senatorial election by complete obvious voter fraud is not a kooky theory. It definitely happened. Epstein getting murdered is not a kooky theory. And so there's there's some of these cases that are marginal and that they are more debatable, and some of them are not, and then they just really double down on those. I agree GameStop wasn't staged, just the result of willful economic ignorance. Gonna go get some rest. Have a good night. All right, Zeris, have a good night. Thoughts on Norway's prison system compared to America's. Just ordered a book called Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. I think she's a leftist, but I think it's an interesting concept. Well, I don't know about Norway. What I'll say about that though, Hackham, is the whole idea that idea of a prison system, I really don't like that idea. Um, because my concept of justice is restorative justice, right? I believe in restitution, and the role of prisons in restitution is quite different or minimal. So the idea that like if you commit a crime, then I mean, it what would be really dumb if you commit a crime would be to pay the state, right? You hurt Jack or John or Jill, and then you pay the state. That would be really dumb. What would be even dumber if you hurt Jack or John or Jill? What we're gonna do is we're gonna tax Jack or John or Jill, and they're gonna pay for your room and board to put you in prison, where you're no good to anybody, including yourself. And I know it's punishment, and that like the reasonable part of that is that it's a deterrent, right? You don't want to go to prison, most people anyway, and so maybe you won't commit a crime, and so there's a deterrent, and that's true. There probably is some deterrent there, but that's where the logic ends. And so I think that it would make much more sense to say you hurt Jack or John or Jill, you have to restore Jack or John or Jill. Now, all all matters of justice are by their very nature approximate. Um, so there's no way like if I break your leg, I can't unbreak your leg. If I murder your child, there's no way I can unmurder your child. But I can pay you restitution anyway, and I can owe you all this money, and so we can. It could be as simple as I continue to work just like normal, but I'm just paying my wages. And if I refuse, then I will be that restitution will be expropriated from me, right? And so if I cooperate, and here's how this would work. If you cooperate, like, listen, you did this, you fucked up, you got to pay restitution. So go ahead and you're going to pay whatever, 50, 60, 70% of your income, whatever it takes, payment plans over how many years, whatever. If you don't, if you say, I'm not going to do that, I fucking hate you, I refuse, like, okay, well, we had a trial and, you had the option to go, and there's a loser pay. So like if they had made a frivolous lawsuit and they would have lost, they would have owed you. But you lost the case, or you didn't show up because you're like, I don't believe in your fucking law, so I'm not going to defend myself. So you lost the case, because if you don't defend yourself in a case, you're going to lose. So if you defend yourself, you go to the case, you lose. You're like, okay, we've got a judgment against you. The judge, the jury, however the system works, the arbitration has determined that you're guilty of this. If you say I'm not going to pay, like, well, they have a legal right. And then that's where you might get a prison system. And it might be something like a factory system where you come in like, you're going to work, and the income from that is going to, part of it's going to be used to pay for the prison system, and the rest of it's going to be to pay your victims. And there's a lot about that could be bad. It's not a perfect system. It's not about reforming, but at least your victims are getting paid, right? Which is better than where your victims are getting taxed to pay for you. That makes no sense at all. And I think many people are not going to want to go to prison. They're going to want to just, if they have the ability to make the restitution, they will, right? Because there's certainly many crimes that you could afford to pay for without, garnishing your wages. Otherwise, you will garnish your wages to do it. That's what I think. Michael Shermer is a hack. Big dumb fat cat, we agree. Is Pizzagate kooky? No, it is not. What convinces you to believe in restorative justice? I hope I already answered that. But that's actual justice. I think that the idea, whatever problems there are with it, and there are, the idea that like, taxing you to put someone else in prison. The deterrent is still there with restorative justice. Nobody wants to have their wages garnished or put into a prison factory, right? So there's still that deterrent, but then you're actually helping the victims. Sorry, guys. You're not the only ones asking questions tonight. Uh, Nothing, Marks. You didn't miss anything. What about quarantining violent people away from society? If they've committed a crime, they owe restitution to those victims, and that needs to be, And if the prison factory's on an island or whatever, that's fine, and I could see them doing that just as a way to, make it difficult for them to escape. That's fine. But if they haven't committed a crime, then their violence isn't obviously that bad. Um, we see the Chinese government buys up influence in Australia and the U.S., whether it is lobbying or buying out parts of the press. What defense would a voluntary society have against this? Um, well, first of all, apparently the states don't have a defense against that. So, again, is this a? It's a good question, and I'm not, but what we always have to remember that we don't want to operate on a double standard here. So comes to like another example would be like, well, how would anarchy protect us if the sun exploded? I'm like, well, it wouldn't. We would be screwed. But the state's not going to protect us either. So I don't know how that's an argument that favors one over the other. And I think that this could be similar to that. But who are they buying influence from, right? If there isn't a government, then there isn't an obvious thing to bribe. Do you see the U.S. declining? It depends on how we mean by decline. It's declining in some ways now. Um, there's so much hate for the rich. Some of it's justified, but most of it is based on envy too. How's the Forest restoration going? Very slowly, but making progress. You should make an update or a new video about circumcision in some manner. I probably will. I have some stuff I could talk about. Have you ever been to the nude beach in Cummington, MA? I have heard about it, but no. I usually go to Rock River, and people talk about it there, but I've heard it's not nearly as nice. Are there any good references on law in an anarchy society when someone hears about anarchy, it's assumed as archaic destruction? Yeah, there's quite a few. Um, the Pursuit of Justice, Law and Anarchy, The Machinery of Freedom. I should probably just. It's this bookshelf right behind me, but you won't be able to see me if I go back there. How about this? Can you, after the video is uploaded, just go ahead and leave a comment because I won't see the text. Leave a comment, and I'll give you a list of several. But Machinery of Freedom is definitely one that comes to mind, and Pursuit of Justice is another one. What do you think of the fact that Trump signed more gun control laws in 4 years than Obama did? Well, I'm not surprised. What are some things you don't like about Gandhi? That he was a socialist. I'm more talking about decreasing the risk of repeat offenses. Um, that's not justice, though, right? That's complete utilitarianism. If that's the case, then we start talking about let's just harvest their organs. So I don't believe in that type of utilitarianism. I think it has a lot of problems, and that's not whatever you want to call that. And there's strong. I'm not dismissing it too much. There's good arguments for utilitarianism, but you're not talking about justice then, right? You're talking about socially managing things, and I look at things in terms of justice when it comes to criminal justice. Are there rich people in history we could consider honorable? Yeah, James J. Hill, right? There's quite a few actually. How is Rock River? What do people say about Cummington? I'm from Western Mass, so I'm trying to find out. There's lots of people who go to Rock River who are from like Pittsfield. So there's a lot of people from Western Mass who will go to Rock River. Rock River, from everything I've heard, Rock River is much nicer. And I've talked to several people who have been to both. Rock River sounds like it's a lot nicer, and Rock River is very, very nice. Um, has the pandemic affected your sex life? No, but my roommate's having a baby did, because my roommate has a baby boy who is uncircumcised. Thank you. And they asked that I not have anybody over until he's older, so that has. What's your opinion of Hans Hermann Hoppe? He's a great thinker, and I don't agree with him on everything, but he made me an anarcho-capitalist, if that tells you anything. His book, Democracy, the God That Failed, and The Myth of the National Defense really pushed me into anarcho-capitalism. Sure, thanks. I can rewatch the video, no problem. Thanks. Just leave a comment there, and I will give you a list of books. But Machinery of Freedom and Pursuit of Justice are two that come right to mind. There's some by Greg Benson, but I'm not remembering the exact title, so put the comment and I'll put the thing. Yeah, I see that. I see your flag. I know that it's an onyx question. Is the nude beach you go to co-ed? So it's in Vermont, and technically everything is a nude beach in Vermont because nudity is legal. There are some females who go, but it's mostly gay men. Yeah, nudity is legal in Vermont. All right, guys, 1 hour and 35 minutes. Leave a comment about the sound quality, uh, because I have a new mic. Right, I got so many audio complaints that I finally got a new one. So, um, thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully more videos soon. All right, I'll talk to you all later. Have you read The Ethics of Liberty? No.